This is a repeat of last month's webinar because due to technical difficulties, we were unable to record, and we had an overwhelming request for recordings. So today's presenter is our very own Tasha Menaker, Director of our Sexual Violence Response Initiatives here at ACESDV. So now I will present it to Tasha.
Thank you, Renee. Good morning, everyone. As Renee said, I'm Tasha. I'm our Director of Sexual Violence Response Initiatives here at the Coalition. So our webinar today is focusing on sexual harassment in the workplace. And the reason we decided to focus on the workplace is because we feel that's the context in which sexual harassment occurs, that we have the most tangible options in terms of response. But that being said, I want to open up this presentation with this quote. And I'm going to let everyone sit with this for a second. I've always really loved this quote because I feel that it's deeply accurate. And even though it is gendered, sexual harassment is a gendered behavior that disproportionately affects women, gender nonconforming people, and people with feminine identities. And I think that this quote is important because women and trans people and people who are gender nonconforming often experience sexual microaggressions everywhere they go. So even though we are focusing on the workplace today, it's important to keep in mind that sexual harassment happens everywhere, and certain people experience it on an almost daily basis in almost every setting. So the grocery store and elevators. And this pervasiveness of sexual harassment impacts the way that victims perceive and respond to this type of behavior. At the Coalition, we recently did some focus groups looking at sexual harassment with both men and women. And it was interesting because in the focus group of women, one of the women said, if I reported everything like this that happened to me, I'd spend my whole life reporting, and people would just think I was crazy. And so I really hope that you can keep this quote in mind as we go throughout this presentation. And also, I think it would be amiss for us to talk about sexual harassment without giving some time and attention to it on a cultural level. And so you all, I'm sure, are probably familiar with the MeToo movement that has gained a lot of cultural momentum over the past several months. This is Tarana Burke, who was the original creator of MeToo almost a decade ago. And so what we've seen with this movement is a number of people coming forward to talk about their experiences of sexual violence and sexual harassment. We have seen celebrities coming forward to report sexual abuse by powerful men in Hollywood. We've seen sexual harassment being disclosed as it's happening at the Arizona legislature. And so I really just want to call out a few things about this before we move forward. First, I think it's really important for us to honor those folks who had the courage to come forward and talk about these experiences. But I also think it's important for us to honor those who haven't come forward and maybe weren't ready to, and who may never be ready to, and that's okay. And also to consider how difficult it was for survivors who had comparatively a lot of resources and power, like celebrities in Hollywood. It was difficult for these people to come forward and disclose. And so when we think about that, let's just remember people who have comparatively less resources and power and who are in positions where if they were to come forward, they have a lot more to lose in terms of social capital. And then I also just want to make the point that this is a systemic issue. And so this is not just about a few bad apples, a few bad men who have a lot of power. This is about power. It is about patriarchy. It's about institutionalized sexism. So if we really want to stop sexual harassment and sexual violence, it's going to take a lot more than just firing or criminalizing people. And so my final point with this is just that it's important to call attention to the fact that sex and sexuality, and therefore sexual harassment, are nuanced and complex issues. Many people are both victims and perpetrators. And we live in a culture where men continue to be sexualized to engage in sexual oppression. Otherwise, those men risk stigma and shame and violence from both other men and women. We hear it said frequently from both men and women, things like man up, right? Or we say that men are expected to make the move if they're interested in someone. And so many men have actually been socialized to be perpetrators without even realizing it. And so I don't say this to excuse sexual harassment or sexual violence, but to uplift the point that we need cultural change, and we need to start having conversations about healthy sexuality, and about our boundaries. Because as I'm going to talk about in more detail moving forward, we all have different boundaries. So it's true, a comment that might be offensive to one person may for another person be perceived as something positive and as a compliment. And so it's important for us to have these conversations up front. And so today we'll be giving some tangibles for addressing sexual violence in the workplace, but those tangibles are never going to be enough until we get serious about having these discussions about healthy sexuality and about consensual, reciprocal, and enjoyable sexual activity. So I'll step off my soapbox. So what is workplace sexual harassment? Workplace sexual harassment encompasses unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature when it explicitly affects an individual's work performance or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. And so people are protected against harassment and discrimination that's based on gender under both federal law, so the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as the Arizona Civil Rights Act. When we're talking about workplace really any sexual harassment, the victim and harasser can be any gender, and the victim does not have to be the opposite gender of the perpetrator. The harasser can be the victim's supervisor, can be a supervisor in another area or another department of the company. It can be a coworker, or it could be a non-employee. So it could be potentially a client, for example. I've done a presentation similar to this at a school, and one of the teachers at the school shared a story about how he was being consistently sexually harassed by a parent of one of his students who he was having to meet with to talk about the student's behavior. And so that is actually considered workplace harassment, and it then becomes the responsibility of that school to take steps to ensure that that teacher does not have to be continually exposed to that type of harassment. And the victim does not just have to be the person harassed, but it could be anyone that's affected by the offensive conduct. And we'll talk more about this, but we all are in workplaces and we know how it is. People have conversations, they talk to each other in workplaces, they might share that they're experiencing this type of harassment. You might work at a small agency or company where it's easy to hear and see harassment happening. And so that creates a certain culture within that organization that generates fear and discomfort for not just the victim, but for others who are bystanders. Sexual harassment can be unlawful even if the harassment does not cause economic injury or discharge of the victim. And it's really key that the harasser's conduct be unwelcome. And so this can be sometimes a tricky area, but I'll give for an example. I work at the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, and I supervise our sexual assault response department. So we're literally talking about sex, good, bad, or otherwise, all day, every day. And so we probably at our organization, I would expect, have different types of policies and boundaries when it comes to talking about sex and sexuality. So what this really will come back to is your organization's policies and how stringent they are when it comes to conversations around sex or sexual harassment. And so also, I mean, a number of us meet our partners at the workplace. And so some workplaces might be more flexible about things like sexual discussion or flirting, and others may not be. So again, it's important if you are someone who has that responsibility or power within the organization to develop policies to keep that in mind, how flexible or stringent you want those to be. Or if you are working in a workplace, or you're working with, or if you're an advocate working with someone who's experiencing workplace sexual harassment, it's going to be really important to look at that organization's policies. So sexual harassment is a form of sexual violence that's often overlooked in the literature. But I wanted to take a moment to call attention to the prevalence of rape and sexual violence in our society. And a number of you, I'm sure, have seen these statistics before. So 1 in 5 women have experienced rape or attempted rape in their lifetime. 1 in 2 women have experienced other forms of sexual violence. So this includes other forms of unwanted sexual contact outside of penetrative sexual assault. 1 in 71 men have experienced rape, and 1 in 5 men have experienced other forms of sexual violence. And I think this is important because it shows that many of us are impacted by sexual violence. Many people have experienced penetrative rape, and those experiences influence how subsequent incidences of sexual harassment and violence impact us. And so if someone has experienced a form of sexual violence and then they're now being sexually harassed in their workplace, that sexual harassment can be very triggering and traumatizing. And I think that that's something that's important to keep in mind as advocates, is that someone might have a whole history of sexual violence leading up to the incident that they might be disclosing to you. I also just want to take a moment to talk about, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts and around the MeToo and sexual harassment and sexual violence issues, and I often hear pundits make what to me I would qualify as value statements sometimes around different types of sexual violence. And so saying things like, well, it was just him, putting his hand on her knee, at least it wasn't rape. It's not like it was rape. And so I think that that's just a dangerous space for us to get into, because everyone experiences trauma differently. And I don't think that it is fair for us to make value statements about what types of trauma are more harmful than others. And I just want us to be careful about using that kind of language, especially if you're working with someone who has experienced sexual harassment. You certainly wouldn't want to minimize their experience as, it was just a verbal, he or she was just making comments. And so, of course, what does this all mean? And I am assuming most of us that are in this training are advocates, and so you know this already, but there are probably survivors in your workplace, among your friends and family, and in this training. And so, let's just move forward in our work and in our lives being thoughtful and compassionate about this, and remembering that everyone has different experiences. We don't always know what those experiences are, and just always engaging people with compassion and empathy. So when it comes to sexual harassment prevalence in the workplace, what we've seen is that between 40 and 75% of women report having experienced some form of sexual harassment at their job. 15 to 19% of men have reported harassment, and 35 to 58% of LGBTQ people have reported sexual harassment in the workplace. But it's likely that these are significant underestimates, because the vast majority of people do not report their sexual harassment to any kind of formal entity. 90% of sexual harassment goes unreported, and we're going to talk in more detail about why that's the case later. Sexual harassment, irregardless if it is a physical or a verbal nature, has a traumatic impact on survivors. It can impact someone's psychological health. So it can lead to symptoms of depression, anxiety, decreased self-esteem, shame, post-traumatic stress disorder, certainly. There can also be physical health repercussions. Depending on the type of sexual harassment, someone might be at risk for sexually transmitted infections or gynecological complications. Trauma can have somatic effects like headaches and migraines and chronic pain and fatigue as well. And it can also impact the survivor's social health. So especially if it's happening at the workplace, that might lead to absences from work. It's not uncommon for people who are being sexually harassed at work to just leave that place of employment and go somewhere else. And that can lead to economic struggles, difficulty while that person is at work, and challenges in other aspects of their social life. And what research has shown is that these impacts happen not just for the person who is directly experiencing the harassment, but also for bystanders in the workplace. And so bystanders have reported not just these types of impacts, but guilt and around not acting, seeing things and not acting up or speaking up, fear that they would also be targeted in the workplace, and also just general stress and vicarious trauma. When it comes to liability, certainly the employer has liability if they fail to respond to a sexual harassment report, but there is also liability upon the harasser. So if improper touching was involved, the victim can sue the harasser for assault and battery. And under Arizona law, victims can also sue for intentional infliction of emotional distress against their harasser. So there are two primary categories of workplace sexual harassment. The first is quid pro quo, or this for that. And so this is the type of sexual harassment that occurs between an employer and an employee. And generally, it's where the employer's favors are contingent upon that employee complying with sexual advances or another form of sexual harassment. So an example might be if an employer is making a raise or promotion contingent upon that person engaging in a sexual act. And sometimes this might be something that's very, like all types of sexual harassment, it may be very overt, or this could happen in more subtle and nuanced ways. So for example, an employee might ask their employer for a raise, and if the employer was to say something like, I think that might be possible, how about we talk about it more over dinner this Friday? There's certainly implications to that. There's certainly a power hierarchy in place, and that's definitely potentially a form of sexual harassment. Another example of this is if the employee has a reasonable fear that they'll lose their job if they don't go along with sexual advances. And there's a great documentary looking at a case where this happened. It's called Rape on the Night Shift, and it's on PBS. And this was a situation, I believe it was in California, where a janitorial company, one of the supervisors was regularly, brutally sexually assaulting the female employees under his watch. Most of these women were janitorial employees. They were working the night shift, cleaning up in, places that many of us frequent, places, department stores and office buildings. And many of these women were either immigrants or they were undocumented. Knowing this, their supervisor used that to his advantage and threatened them that if they were to tell anyone about him sexually assaulting them, that they would not be believed. They would be the ones who would be fired, and that they also ran the risk of being deported or criminalized if they were to say anything about what he was doing. And of course, that's a very legitimate risk and fear for those women. But eventually, many of them did finally report. And I pulled a screenshot of a letter that some of the women wrote to one of the higher ups at the company, and you can see it says, "P.S. This is not gossip. It is all true. Please help us." So I'd highly recommend watching that. It's a good example of sexual harassment and violence in the workplace. The second category of sexual harassment is creating a hostile work environment. And so this is harassment that can occur between an employer and an employee or among coworkers. So it's unwanted verbal or physical contact of a sexual nature that interferes with the victim's work performance or creates a hostile work environment. And this includes targeting someone based on their gender identity or sexual orientation. When we talk about sexual harassment, it's important to keep in mind that the root of all sexual violence is always power. It comes back to having a disregard for another person's humanity, for their integrity, for what they want and for what they want. But sexual harassment and sexual violence perpetrators can have different motivations. So when we're talking about sexual harassment in the workplace, although the root of it is power, it sometimes can be motivated by sexual gratification or entitlement. And that's most often, I think, what we think of when we're talking about sexual harassment. But it can also include harassment that is motivated by trying to push someone out of the workplace. So I'm going to give some examples of this later on in the presentation when we talk about sexual bullying. And I believe that people at the workplace I was at previously, not now, were engaging in sexual bullying because this person was was an open lesbian, quite frankly, and they wanted to push her out of the workplace. So sexual harassment is an umbrella term that incorporates a variety of different behaviors, and that it could be physical in nature or could be verbal in nature. And it's important to address sexual harassment early on because these behaviors can escalate over time. I'm assuming that most of the folks in this training are aware of indecent exposure, stalking, and sexual assault, rape. So I'm not going to go into detail about those types of behaviors, though of course if anyone has any questions you can use the Q&A box or the chat if you need clarification on anything. But I'm going to focus on these other forms of sexual harassment, which can sometimes be more nuanced and less clear and more invisible. So the first is sexual advances. Now, it's important, again, that for a sexual advance to be considered sexual harassment, it has to be unwelcome and pervasive. And so as I mentioned before, many of us, we spend much of our life at work, right? And that might be where we meet meet our partner who we end up marrying. And so it's not to say that sexual advances or flirting are always inappropriate in the workplace. Again, that's going to depend on the workplace policy. But for it to reach the point, for it to be considered or for it to be considered harassment, it needs to be unwelcome. So some examples of this might include disrespecting someone's relationship status or their partner. So if someone was to know that the other person was in a relationship, maybe making derogatory comments about that person's partner, saying things like, well, she can't do what I could do for you. Needlessly asking someone to stay late or partner on projects that are outside of their duties. It could potentially include asking someone out socially, like for drinks or a date, and I gave an example of that earlier when the employee was asking for a raise. Coming on to someone or flirting, constantly commenting on someone's appearance. And so this is more than providing a compliment like, oh, you look really nice today. You know, these are things like every day, and it doesn't have to be every day, but if it's done in a way that's making another person feel uncomfortable or uneasy, then that's a form of sexual harassment. So focusing on someone's appearance, you are just so beautiful, you could have any guy you want. That could be a form of sexual harassment. And then certainly pressuring someone to perform a sexual act. Or maybe it's just violating someone's physical space. And sometimes it's difficult when we're to articulate when these things are happening and to make a report about this, but it's something that we all feel and know. In America, we have a 3-foot bubble of personal space. And so if someone violates that 3-foot bubble, you'll notice people will like step back or try and make that space between themselves and the other person again. And so we feel it when someone is getting within our personal space in a way that's inappropriate. Sexual coercion is a form of sexual harassment. It manifests as relentless pressure and manipulation. It doesn't always have to involve physical force, but more of that psychological and emotional manipulation. So saying things like, come on, why are you being like this? Are you serious? Well, then I think we should break up. Please, I just really like you. It's not a big deal. No one's ever going to know, I promise. You're being stupid. Just do it. You're ridiculous. So really engaging in that relentless pressure in a way that breaks down someone's will and is getting them to comply with a sexual advance. The distributing or displaying of pornography is certainly in the workplace, is certainly inappropriate and is a form of sexual harassment. And it is illegal to secretly take photos or video of someone's genitalia, buttocks, or breasts. Their body does not have to be unclothed for this to be illegal. If you're taking if someone is taking photos of another person's body of these body parts, then that's actually that is actually a criminal behavior. It's also illegal to show or distribute those images or videos without the other party's consent. And I think, so while it may not be a criminal act to display photos or images that are objectifying in your workplace, it's something that as employers should be, you should strongly consider having in any kind of HR policy, because for many people, having those images up in the workplace can be uncomfortable and can be a form of sexual harassment. So things like we've all seen calendars with both men and women in it that have them in sexual or objectifying positions. And so depending on the workplace, that could also be a form of sexual harassment. Sexual remarks are a common form of sexual harassment, and this is the form of sexual harassment that often gets mischaracterized both by perpetrators and society as simply being jokes or compliments. But really, these are harmful and insidious forms of violence. So this can include things like name-calling, calling someone a slut, calling someone homo. MILF stands, Google it, it stands for Mother I'd Like To, and I'll let you fill in the F. And while a perpetrator or an offender, I should say a harasser, might see calling someone a MILF as being a compliment because you are saying, theoretically saying something positive about someone's appearance, can actually be extremely dehumanizing and objectifying for someone, and it's definitely not appropriate for the workplace. Sexual innuendo or teasing could be included in this. Some of you may have heard it's a pretty standard sexual innuendo, "That's what she said." So an example might be two employees, they're in a stock room and one's trying to fit a box up on a high shelf and they're struggling and they're saying, "I just don't think this is going to fit." And the other employee says, "That's what she said." That's a form of sexual innuendo that can be a form of sexual harassment. This also includes mocking someone's behavior based on their gender identity or sexuality. So making fun of someone's tone, for example, or the inflections that they have in their voice, calling someone shrill. Those are all forms of harassment that are rooted and stereotyped around gender identity and frankly rooted in misogyny. Talking about pornography or about acts in pornography, if you all remember the Anita Hill case, this was a significant piece of her complaint about Clarence Thomas. He would often at work talk about pornography that he had viewed and the different acts that he had seen in pornography. And in that case, there was a lot of extreme descriptions about things like bestiality. And he would ask her questions about what she was interested in or if she watched pornography like that. Which ties into asking or talking about things like sexual fantasies or preferences or experiences. And again, this is going to depend on your workplace and the relationship between the two people. So, relationships evolve over time, and that's why it's important to have communication about things like this. We're certainly not advocating that sex be some kind of taboo subject that is never discussed, because as I mentioned earlier, we really need to actually be having conversations around healthy sexuality if we truly want to end sexual harassment. But relationships evolve, and so an example might be, say me and Bill work together, and this was just a part of our relationship. We're friends. We often talk about, our sexual experiences outside the workplace, or we talk about our sexual preferences with one another, and that is something that was mutual and consensual between the two of us. But Bill gets a girlfriend, and his girlfriend doesn't feel comfortable with him talking about those types of things with another woman. At that point, then, it would be important for Bill to communicate that information with me, right? Because if our relationship up until that point was that this was a sensual dialogue between the two of us, I probably would come to work and continue trying to engage in that dialogue without knowing any better. And so it would be on Bill's responsibility to let me know, like, hey, I'm not comfortable with this anymore. I don't want to talk like this at work anymore. This can also include commenting on someone's appearance. And again, this is where I think that there is a lot of confusion in society or concern around what's the difference between harassment and a compliment. In many ways, I feel like that's a false concern because most people who are on the receiving end, they know the difference between a compliment and harassment. And I don't think we've had a history of, I think that this false concern is primarily directed at women. And I would argue we don't really have a history of women coming forward making false complaints about men giving them compliments. When most people, when you're giving a compliment, which is innocuous, that's going to be conveyed in your body language and in your tone. Versus harassment. And if you were genuinely intending to give a compliment and that person did find it offensive, then it just becomes your responsibility to apologize and sincerely and move forward. So what we're talking about with appearance is things like asking someone's bra size or making jokes with other people at work about a coworker or making bets about, well, what size is their bra, do you think? Or making comments consistently and pervasively in a way that makes the other person uncomfortable about the clothing that they're wearing, how tight their jeans are, how good they look in that shirt. And in this day and age, it's really important for us to consider the role of social media in this. And so sexual harassment in the workplace does include comments that are posted on social media or pictures that are posted on social media that might be offensive to someone. I can give another example of this that actually came out of one of the focus groups that we did around sexual harassment, where we were asking questions about the confusion between making jokes and actually harassing someone. And so one of the participants said, well, you know, I do think that women are being too sensitive about sexual harassment these days. I joke all the time at work that, and it might include sexual innuendo. And so we asked, can you give us an example? And he said that at his workplace, it sounded as though they had a warehouse with big open spaces. And he gave an example of where one of his female coworkers was walking down the hallway and he was walking behind her and he shouted out to her, I'm stalking you, haha. And she turned around and was like, oh no, stranger danger. And he gave that as an example of like, you know, see, she got it, she understood. She understood that I wasn't really stalking her, and she saw the humor in that. And so we asked, well, do you make jokes like that to your male coworkers? And he thought about it and he said, well, yeah, I do. And so we asked for an example and he said, well, you know, if I was running into my male coworker at the refrigerator frequently, I might say something like, we have to stop meeting like this. And I thought that that was really telling and interesting because it seemed genuine that in his mind, he saw no distinction between these two types of, you know, quote unquote jokes. But we have to really question why we think it's okay to turn stalking and sexual violence into a joke, and why the provision of that type of joking was gendered. Sexual rumors are another form of sexual harassment. So these might be things like spreading rumors or voicing assumptions about someone else's gender identity or their orientation or their sexual history, saying things like, oh, well, she really seems uptight, or I bet he's really good at bed. Those are inappropriate statements to be making at work. Again, they're dehumanizing and objectifying your coworkers, and they should be avoided. It's not our business to try and figure out another person's sexual orientation or their ability in the bedroom. This can also include sharing information about sexual experiences with coworkers. So telling coworkers, if you do have a sexual relationship with one of your coworkers, then going into the workplace and sharing information about that encounter with other coworkers without the person you had that relationship with consent. And then finally, fabricating sexual experiences with coworkers. And I have an example of this where this happened to me, although it's kind of humorous because although I technically was a victim, I had the power in the dynamic. And so you can chuckle when I tell this story. So my master's degree is in clinical psychology. And so as part of that, I had to do clinical practicum hours where I did counseling with high school students. And at the time, I honestly wasn't too much older than them. I was about 22. And so there were some students that were, 17 and actually even some 18-year-olds. And it was a small school in a rural Texas town, in a very small town. And it's a high school. So of course, when I would be in counseling with the different students, they would all tell me things that the other students were saying during the day. And so one of the students I had counseling with, it was a male, and he was one of the older ones. I think he was 17. And when I came back to the school the next day, a number of the other students were like, I'm going to call him John. John was saying that you all had a date and he took you to the Red Lobster. And so of course that was kind of amusing to me because, in all his wildest fantasies, he could have made up anything that he wanted to make up. And, what he came up with is we went to the Red Lobster together, which of course wasn't true. And of course that was something, that I had to address with him. And it really wasn't too harmful to me, like, as I said, as the person who really had the power in that relationship. But you can see how this could manifest in a much different way in the workplace, where someone might be lying and saying that they had sexual interactions with a coworker when they did not. Unwanted sexual contact generally tends to speak for itself, but this can happen in more covert ways. So for example, I had a coworker who used to be a bartender, and she talked about she had a coworker who was also a bartender, and every time he would go past her behind the bar, he would brush past her body with his full body every time, even though there was enough space behind the bar for that not to happen at all. So that's one example of how this can happen in a way that's covert and sometimes might make the person on the receiving end of that question the intent of the harasser and question whether or not was this actually sexual harassment. This actually happened to me as well when I was in graduate school. I had a professor who would engage in unwanted touching of this nature, but it was in a covert enough way. And of course, given our relationship and the power dynamic there, made me question whether I was making more of something than actually was happening. For example, I remember one time I was walking out of a room and I was going first, and so I was holding the door open with my hand, and he was coming out behind me, and so he went to kind of hold the door open as well, but when he did that, he put his hand slightly on top of my hand. And so it was like a small thing that actually, it like made me really uncomfortable, because it wasn't necessary, and that isn't generally normal. Generally, we're very conscious of other people's boundaries, and so, you know, most people would be very aware of making sure they don't touch the other person's hand. But of course, you know, in the moment, it made me uncomfortable, and then later I doubted myself and wondered, you know, was I just misinterpreting it? Maybe he just wasn't paying attention. And it wasn't until a number of these incidents had happened that I really finally was convinced that there was actually something problematic going on. But I bring this up to call attention to the fact that that's often the experience of people who are being victimized by sexual harassment. You know, we tend to doubt ourselves and to question the validity sometimes of our own experiences. And my advice would be, you know, trust your instinct, and if it doesn't feel right to you, then it probably isn't right. This can also include things like giving hugs without consent. And I think we're a culture, we're getting better about these types of things, but we often just expect that, you know, that everybody enjoys being hugged, which of course isn't true. And so it's not appropriate to immediately assume that and go in for a hug, because people feel obligated then to reciprocate that, and that can make them uncomfortable. So it's always better just to ask for consent, or if you're not sure, to not do it at all. Of course, grabbing, pinching, slapping, shoulder rubs or massages at work, overt acts like kissing. And remember, there's often an inherent power hierarchy within the workplace, and especially between employers and employees. And so even if an employer or someone who has relatively more power in the organization asks for consent first, employees might not always feel it's a safe space for them to say no. And so that's why in the workplace, it's often better just to avoid things like, you know, hugging or excessive touching, because the power hierarchies are so great that people don't always feel safe to say no. Sexual bullying is a form of harassment that's often overlooked, and I referenced this earlier when I talked about my previous job. So this can be things like drawing genitalia or pornography or things of a sexual nature on someone's property, putting sexual objects like toys or condoms or products in someone's desk or property. And this relates to that example I was referencing. So my very first job when I was a teenager was as a dispatcher at animal control. And among the officers, they hired, at least in my time there, it was the first officer we had that was openly identified as a lesbian. And shortly after we hired her, she started getting pornography. Pornography started randomly appearing in her truck. People were putting condoms in her locker. And so these were things that were very clearly sexual bullying, and in my mind, intended to really make her feel uncomfortable and try and push her out of the agency. So this can be things that other people might qualify as pranks, but they really are a form of violence. There's a good movie that illustrates this called, it's old, but it's good. It's called North Country. And it's based on a true story of some of the first women who were employed in the coal industry in one of the Dakotas, I believe. I can't recall which one. But it's a great movie, and it documents kind of a landmark civil case. And there's a lot of examples of sexual bullying in it. It's also important for us to call attention to sexual harassment that's targeted at people who identify as transgender or who are gender nonconforming. And so being a person who is transgender, it means that their gender identity does not align with the sex that they were assigned at birth by a doctor. So we know generally at the time of birth, a doctor will assign the sex of the baby. Usually it's based purely on anatomy. So a doctor might assign someone Well, so when I was born, I was assigned female at birth based on my anatomy. My gender identity is also female, so I'm cisgender. But for someone who maybe was assigned female at birth, but their gender identity is male, they might identify as transgender. Some people do not identify within the binary of male and female at all. They might be gender non-binary. There's a lot of different genders and sexual orientation. And people who identify outside of that normative gender identity of a cisgender heterosexual person are often subjected to disproportionate rates of sexual violence and physical violence and harassment in the workplace and outside of it. And so it is not appropriate at work, if you are working with someone who is transgender and is open about it, well, whether they're open about it or not, but if they're open about it, it's not appropriate to ask them about their body, to ask whether they've had any surgeries or not, to say things like, oh, okay, so you're really a man, or you're really a woman. It's certainly not appropriate to call someone an it. It's a form of sexual harassment to refuse to use the name or the pronouns given by the person. It might happen that you're working with someone who decides who transitions while they, are working, or who are in the process of transitioning while you are working with them. So it may be possible that when you met them, their name was Bill, their pronouns were he, him. And after they transition, their name is Sheila and their pronouns are she, hers. You should respect the name that the person provides, just like you would want someone to respect the name that you provide, as well as the pronouns you provide. And so it's a form of sexual harassment if someone intentionally and purposefully continues to misname someone or misgender someone or use the wrong pronouns. It's also inappropriate and a form of sexual harassment to laugh or mock a person's gender expression or their identity. And I actually had a good example that I meant to give earlier and I forgot, but this slide actually calls it to mind for me. And I wanted to give this example because it actually happened recently, and I think it's a good example for showing nuances around sexual harassment in the workplace. So I have a current coworker whose friend works in another state in a place of employment that's entirely men, mostly heterosexual identified white men. It's a landscaping company. They have a unspoken policy that they do not hire women. And so there's really kind of a culture in her friend, we'll call him Bill, in Bill's workplace, where there isn't space for someone to step outside of that white, straight gender identity and sexual orientation. Well, Bill one day was not feeling, or he had allergies, and so he was coughing and sneezing a lot at work, and one of his coworkers came up to him and was like, hey man, are you sick? Like, what's going on? He said, oh no, I just have allergies. And his coworker was like, yeah, if we spent half the money that we spent on AIDS prevention, we would have a cure for the common cold by now. And he said, and he followed it up with, I have a cure for AIDS. It's about a lifestyle. And so I actually would like to open it up to you all, just to make sure y'all are paying attention. What does that mean? Is that a form of sexual harassment? And what did the coworker mean when he said, I have a cure for that. It's about lifestyle. I'm going to give you a second. If you want to use the Q&A or you can use the chat, it's up to you. All right, I'm waiting for feedback from you all. Is that a form of sexual harassment? Sarah says yes. What else? Susie, I see Susie raised their hand. Do you have a question, or are you saying yes, that it is a form of sexual harassment? Yes, it is. Susie, thank you. What did that coworker mean when he said, you know, it's about lifestyle? What's the implication of that? Yes, he has no idea if the individual has AIDS. Yeah, so the implication there, right, is that only certain people have AIDS, that this is a problem, right, because it is a problem among people who engage in sex with people who are the same gender as them. And yeah, you don't know. First of all, that's making the assumption that Bill is a straight white, you know, or well, is a straight cisgender man who that is not HIV positive or who does not have AIDS, that he doesn't know people who are in that situation, and that that's something that he would find funny and support. None of, you know, and he didn't. He found it really offensive, you know, irregardless of his varying intersecting identities. But what does this do in the workplace? You know, this really, in that workplace in particular, creates a prison for people working within it, that they have to conform to a certain norm and standard around gender identity and sexual orientation. And so I think I wanted to bring that up as an example because it shows that sexual harassment does not always, I think we have a stereotypical perception of sexual harassment, that this is a heterosexual phenomenon, that it involves one person who's sexually interested in another person and therefore engages in inappropriate actions towards them, or that it's a cause of, or that it's a source of entitlement. But this is also, what happened to Bill is also a form of sexual harassment, and it's just a much more nuanced example. Thank you for those who participated. So as I mentioned earlier, not only is sexual harassment a civil issue, but some of these behaviors could result in criminal charges. And so I put up the statutes for you around the behaviors that are criminal. So that includes secretly photographing or videotaping. Remember, someone's genitalia, buttocks, or breasts. It includes indecent exposure, the unlawful distribution of sexual images, unwanted sexual contact, and of course, sexual assault or rape. And I want to take a moment to talk about victim blaming as well, because when it comes to sexual violence broadly and sexual harassment in particular, victim blaming is really pervasive. We know that it is so insidious that victims who experience sexual harassment or sexual violence, often the first thing they do, right, is blame themselves and run through all the scenarios of things that they should have done differently to prevent this from happening to them. And it really, you know, victim blaming, when it occurs in a workplace, when it occurs anywhere, can really create a dangerous environment and culture, because it takes the culpability and responsibility away from the perpetrator or the harasser and now places it upon the victim. And victim blaming is something that we see reflected in the media among people with significant political and economic power. So you can see Liam Neeson saying the Me Too campaign it's healthy, but it's also a bit of a witch hunt. A Democratic congresswoman says it's the responsibility of the female to prevent sexual harassment. Donald Trump Jr. says women who can't handle harassment don't belong in the workforce. We see fashion designers saying, you know, victims were asking for it. And here's an example of a tweet calling these women out, saying they're frauds because they're dressed like hookers. And so what, you know, I just put this up here to reflect that we live in a rape culture where victim blaming is pervasive, where survivors and potential victims see this in the media and of course are dissuaded to come forward to talk about any of their experiences because they have a legitimate concern that there will be backlash or that they'll be disbelieved or that their experiences will be minimalized. So I wanted to put up some comments that are common and are often associated with sexual harassment that occurs in the workplace. So saying things like, well, you flirt with him all the time. Why are you bringing this up now? You were laughing at the time. Well, you shouldn't have been drinking so much. Well, that's why you shouldn't date coworkers. Well, why were you in his office after hours? Man up, it's not a big deal. I really just think you're being too sensitive. Whatever, dude, you liked it. Well, that's why you shouldn't dress like a slut at work. It was just a joke. Well, that sounds like a compliment to me. And I think as you all, hear these things, I'm sure that they resonate for many of us, because these are things that victims of sexual harassment hear, not just from, formal entities that they might disclose to, but other coworkers or friends and family. So that takes us into some of the common barriers to reporting sexual harassment, because remember, 90% of people do not come forward to report. One of the primary reasons is because the survivor might question whether that was actually harassment. And because we so often frame harassment as being jokes or as being compliments, or because, we're afraid to come forward because we don't want to be seen as the person who is making a big deal out of nothing. So, for example, what I shared about me and the professor. The legitimate fear of being blamed for what happened to them, well, you shouldn't have been dressed that way at work, or disbelieved. Worried about causing drama in the office. Coming forward to make a sexual harassment complaint can be kind of an arduous process. It might end up looping in other people who may have witnessed any kind of harassment, and that's a big step for someone, and it's understandable, that a lot of people might just want to keep the peace and, quote unquote, suck it up and just move forward. I don't think any of us would feel great if we knew we were going to be losing our jobs tomorrow. That economic stability is really important. And some people really, frankly, just cannot afford to lose their job because they might be homeless the next day if they do. And so that is a legitimate concern for many people for not coming forward. Fear of retaliation, it's valid that someone might be concerned that if they do come forward to report and they aren't believed or they are blamed, and now this person who is harassing them knows that they said something, that person, they have to see this person every day at work and they may want to retaliate against them. They might not want to get the harasser in trouble. And for those of you who do this work with survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual violence as well, you are familiar with the fact that a lot of times survivors, they just want the violence to stop. They just want the harassment to stop. They don't necessarily want the perpetrator to go to prison or to lose their job or to be put in a position where they now are their life is going to be in harm and potential harm, or where their financial stability might be at risk. The victim really just wants the behavior to stop. But we don't give a lot of options for survivors of sexual and domestic violence. In America, we don't give a lot of options for them to seek help and support and healing and reconciliation with the perpetrator outside of the criminal justice system. Or they might be afraid that nothing will be done, and they've come forward and they've said this, and now the harasser knows and other people at work know, and it's caused this whole hoopla at work, and nothing's going to come of it anyway. So remember, no one ever asks or deserves to be sexually victimized. I don't care how they were dressed at work. I don't care if they flirt with everyone at work, or they've had a lot of partners, or they've dated that person before. None of that matters. No one is ever asking to be sexually victimized, and sexual harassment is never the victim's fault. So I'm going to briefly talk about the responsibility of the employer in these situations, and then we'll give some more tangible examples at the end of the presentation. But it is the responsibility of the employer to create a safe, inclusive environment regardless of someone's gender or gender identity, their sexual orientation, as well as a number of other things, right? Like race or immigration status, etc. Employers should have a clear no tolerance policy on sexual harassment and other prohibited behaviors that relate to sexual harassment. There should be an effective and clear complaint process established that is easily accessible to employees. So an employee should know exactly where that process is detailed, whether it's in the HR manual, whether it's available online for them, whatever that looks like. And it's important that that process, I always struggle with how to explain this piece of it, but often an agency will have kind of a chain of command where, if any type of sexual harassment occurs, then you report that harassment, for example, to this specific HR person. Well, what if that specific HR person is the person who's perpetrating the harassment? And that isn't unlikely, right? Because we know when a person has kind of inordinate power within an organization, it puts them at greater risk for ultimately perpetrating this type of behavior. So it's important in that grievance process that there isn't just one person who the victim can report to, in case that one person is actually the perpetrator. Of course, we don't want to engage in any type of victim blaming comments or minimalization of the event. And I think when men in particular experience sexual harassment, minimalization is the common response, because we still have this cultural myth that, well, men always want sex, regardless of who it's with or when it happens. And that's not true. Everybody has a right to choose when and where and how they engage in sexual activity. So we don't want to blame or minimize any situation, and to take immediate and appropriate action in the case of a complaint. If you are experiencing sexual harassment, or of course with those folks that are in this training, if you're working with someone who's experiencing it, it's really important that the victim directly informs the harasser that they need to stop. And I know, I've been in the situation of being on the receiving end of harassment. I didn't say anything sometimes, and it's really difficult to step up in these situations. There's a lot to lose. And I think especially, for women and trans folks and people who are gender nonconforming, we really put ourselves sometimes at risk of physical harm, right, if we stand up against violence and harassment. But when it's happening in the workplace, the victim really has to tell the harasser directly to stop, because it needs to be documented. And also, going back to some of the things I was mentioning earlier about how harassment happens in nuanced ways, sometimes harassers genuinely don't realize that what they're doing is unwelcome. And because part of that is because we're often socialized, right, to be polite when people are doing these types of things to us. We don't want to cause problems, so we're polite. We just say, when we get that unwanted sexual remark, we're just like, oh, thanks, and sometimes harassers genuinely don't know. And so it's always important for the person on the receiving end to let the other person know it's unwelcome, because then at that point, if it persists after that point, then it's easier to take that to a place of reporting. So some suggestions of things that someone can say if they're on the receiving end, just no. We are not socialized to say no, and sometimes that's just what you have to do. Stop doing that. I'm not interested. That's inappropriate. You're really making me uncomfortable. And it can be really powerful to just say, stop harassing me. It's critical to document the harassment. Everything that happens, document it. If there's any voicemails or emails, images, anything on social media, print, document, and save all of those things, and then follow your organization's grievance system. If you feel as though your organization is not handling it appropriately, then you can take the report to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and we have that information at the end of the presentation. Generally, during a sexual harassment investigation, employers are going to consider a number of factors on a case-by-case basis. So they're going to look at the circumstances of the harassment. They're going to look, did that victim was it made clear to the harasser that that behavior was unwelcome and unwanted? That's going to be critical. They're going to look at the nature of the advances in the harassment and the context in which these incidences occurred. So again, I said this already, it's important to notify the offender and to have that documentation when you bring your case forward. So for those of you who are on this call and are advocates working with someone who might be disclosing sexual harassment, we wanted to give you some tips. And it's really difficult, I think, when we're talking about sexual harassment, because there really isn't always an outlet in our society to report sexual harassment, especially that harassment that's happening outside of the workplace. And so just like all forms of sexual violence, I think there are two fundamental tenets to keep in mind. The first is just active listening. Sexual violence survivors are often distinct from domestic violence survivors, or at least the advocacy that you'll provide, because for many survivors of domestic violence, there's tangibles that we can provide. There's a safety plan that we can engage in, orders of protection. There's a lot of different steps that we know and are familiar with that we can work through with a survivor. sometimes with a sexual violence survivor, there aren't tangibles, there aren't steps. There's no need necessarily for a safety plan. And really what that survivor just needs is someone who's going to be present, who is going to be an active listener, who's not going to blame them or shame them, and is just going to be there with them in the moment. And the second tenet is just emotional validation, because we know that there's so much stigma and shame and blame associated with sexual violence. And so survivors come to the table, right, already engaging in self-blame, doubting their own experiences, and having a whole slew of emotions, right, just like anyone who's experienced trauma. And so it can be really important when you're working with someone who has experienced sexual harassment. Sometimes all it is just to listen and validate their feelings. Like, I understand why you feel frustrated, or I understand why you might feel that way, but it's not your fault, or you didn't deserve to be treated like that, or the only person to blame is the person that did that to you. And sometimes those things alone can go a really long way. And I know as advocates, sometimes we forget that because, you know, we want to help that person as much as possible and feel like we're really giving them tools and tangibles. And we should just never lose sight of these fundamentals. But that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Ginger, who does have some tangibles for you all who might be working with someone who is reporting sexual harassment.
Okay, so we're going to talk just a little bit about injunction against harassment. So it's very similar to an order of protection. It's just it's different. It's a difference in relationship. So an order of protection would fall under when it's an intimate partner, when it's somebody perhaps who people who have been married before, who have a child in common, who used to be intimate partners or dating partners. An injunction against harassment would apply when none of that relationship is present between the two people. So you're probably going to run into this a little bit more if you're working with people who are dealing with workplace harassment, because this would be appropriate among coworkers who have never dated, don't have a child in common, those kinds of things. So it's very similar. And if you are an advocate who helps your clients to get an order of protection, a lot of this is going to sound very familiar because it's a similar process. So the first thing you're going to want to make sure to do is you just want to be really familiar with the courts and the process. So find out what your local courts are. If you have time, it's always a good idea to go and sit and listen in on the order of protection hearings and the injunction against harassment hearings, just to kind of become familiar with what the judges in your jurisdiction are doing with these. What kinds of details are they looking for? What kinds of questions, follow-up questions are they asking for? Just so you can help your client to fill out the paperwork a little bit more thoroughly at the front end. Along with that, the initial preparation of the paperwork is really important. Whatever they write in the initial paperwork is the only thing that the judge is able to consider. So legally, they cannot consider anything that was not put in that original petition. So if this hearing is contested later on, and your client has only put in the latest 3 incidents that had happened, but this has been maybe ongoing for a year and there are multiple incidents, and then this hearing is contested, and the person they're trying to get this injunction against says, you know, is great with words or whatever, and they are convincing the judge that it was all a misunderstanding, it wasn't actually harassment, and then your client comes forward and says, oh, but judge, like, this has been happening for a long time, and this has been a pattern, and I've told him several times that it made me uncomfortable. Legally, the judge cannot take into consideration any of those other incidents. So you just want to make very sure that they're getting the full picture in that initial paperwork. Also, make connections with the court advocates and the court personnel. Know who your clients are working with. Go down there, introduce yourself, get to know who they are, what they can do. And that way, if you're unable to accompany your client down to court, you can do a warm handoff. You can say, I know that so-and-so is working on Tuesdays down at the court where you can get this injunction. I know what kind of work this advocate does. You can call them up and say, hey, I'm sending somebody down there to you. It just makes the whole process a little bit more comfortable and easier. And you know that you're handing your client off to someone that's, that you know what their work product is. Another really important thing that people run into is you want to be well aware of language barriers and plan well in advance. Some of the courts, there might be a delay and getting an interpreter. So if you have a client that you know is going to need an interpreter, it's a really good idea to contact the court ahead of time, find out what the options are, and make sure that an interpreter is going to be available. If your client just goes down there and needs an interpreter, especially maybe if they have a language that's not too common in this area, it could really cause a lot of delays for them in order to get this injunction. So along with the language barriers, it's also important to know that in some of the courts, the documents and forms are in English and Spanish, but they have to be filled out in English. So if you've got a client who needs to fill out the documents in Spanish, you're definitely going to want to make sure that an interpreter is with them. It seems to me common sense. If they need to read them in Spanish, they're probably going to need to fill them out in Spanish. I don't know why some of the courts have it that way, but yeah, you're going to definitely want to be aware of that. Another really important thing, just make sure your clients have specific information about the respondent. If they know the name and address or work address or somewhere where they know they're going to be consistently, so that they can be served with this order once it's signed. That's really important. If they can't serve the order, they cannot enforce it. So you want to make sure that they have that information. And they really want to be specific with their statement, going back to the beginning of this section, showing events, dates of the acts, and they want to be very thorough. Make sure they give a full picture. In general, you're going to want to start with the most recent incident and work your way backwards in time and really try to establish that pattern as much as possible. Next thing, we're just going to kind of go back to the general advocacy. These are just the advocacy skills that you already have and you already work with, and you just want to keep in mind that it's really important to incorporate this in with the process of getting an injunction against harassment. You want to go through safety planning, obviously. You want to have a thorough conversation with your client about what safety planning looks like. Do they need safety planning for if they do get the injunction? And do they need a separate safety plan for if they don't get the injunction or if they decide not to go forward with applying for an injunction against harassment? It's a good idea to talk to them about, do they know what their workplace policy is on harassment? Do they know what the policy is on injunctions against harassment and orders of protection? For example, their workplace might have a very thorough policy on how they handle workplace harassment, but they might have never thought about how are they going to handle two people who work together and all of a sudden there's an injunction against harassment between the two of them. They have a policy about, are they going to terminate somebody in that situation? Are they going to transfer somebody to a new location? And you really want to kind of talk to them about, like, what would that mean? If they have a policy of transferring, are they going to transfer your client to a location that would be difficult for them to get to? Or would they be transferring the respondent to another location? So these are all things to be aware of when they're kind of trying to decide whether or not an injunction against harassment is the right fit for them. Also, you're going to want to talk to your client. What do they know about their HR department and how they are likely to handle the situation? It's entirely possible that the situation has come up with other people in their workplace, and they might have been a witness to, this is how HR handled it, this is what I can expect from them. These are the outcomes that happened in that other situation, again, to kind of help them decide whether or not this is the right option for them. And also you want to talk about how far is the client comfortable going with this. Maybe your client says, I know how HR has handled this in the past, and the person who's being harassed generally is terminated. Sometimes your client might say, I really want to make a stand for myself, and I'm okay with being terminated. I really want to stand up for myself. And others, that's obviously not going to be an option. And they might say, you know what, I need to figure out a different kind of safety plan, one that's not going to get me fired. If they are fired, are they willing to go forward with maybe a civil suit or taking their complaints higher? So you just want to go over all of the possible outcomes and talk to them about, like, how far are they willing to go? Where do they need to stop? What do they need to do to make sure that they and their families are taken care of? And what the contingency plan is. So if this is the outcome, how are you going to handle this to make sure that you can still pay your bills, you still feel safe at work, you still feel stay safe at home. So it's just, like I said, it's just a general advocacy. You just want to have those really thorough conversations with them and try and go over all possible outcomes so they can make the most informed decision about what is the best option for them. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Tasha.
Thank you, Gender. She did a really great job. She has a cold. She didn't want to tell you. So how do we prevent sexual harassment? So I want to talk about this on multiple levels, starting with at the individual level. It's always important just to err on the side of caution. If you're not sure whether something is going to be interpreted or perceived as a compliment or as a form of harassment, then it's probably just best not to say or do anything. And pay attention to nonverbal cues. We're human beings. We generally can identify the difference between flirting and harassment. We can tell when two people are in a situation that's reciprocal and mutual, and when two people are in a situation that's not. And at the end of the day, consent is critical for any type of sexual behavior. So what is consent? I'm going to give you our definition of consent as the coalition, but I do think consent is kind of an interesting issue and topic that I would encourage you all to kind of self-reflect on what you feel consent means. But for us, a person consents to a sexual act by agreeing to it freely and willingly without being forced or coerced. So in other words, if force or coercion is in the room, then consent is not possible. It's an agreement to engage in sexual activity. Silence does not mean yes. Again, remembering those power hierarchies that are often in place where people don't feel safe to say no. Has to be given by a sober, conscious individual, given freely with no emotional or physical force, and keeping in mind that consent to one act does not mean consent to all acts. It's an active process. And this goes back to take it back to sexual harassment in the workplace. The example I gave of, the fictional situation between me and a coworker where previously we had consent to talk to each other about, our sexual interests, and then that changed. And so remembering that it can change and that's okay, and people have a right to change their mind. And to me, I think it's really important always to take it back to these nonverbal cues, because everyone does have different boundaries. So again, what might be offensive to me might be a compliment to somebody else. And so for someone who's potentially, considering saying or doing something, pay attention to how people respond to that. Are they avoiding eye contact? Do they seem uncomfortable when you said? Did they seem uncomfortable when you said it? And as I mentioned before, we're humans. Most of us are pretty familiar with nonverbal cues. So, we know when someone seems bored or uninterested. We see it. We can tell when someone's zoning out. We know what it looks like when someone's a little shocked or surprised by something or confused. We feel it when people pull away from us. And we can recognize when someone's saying yes, but that doesn't really seem like an enthusiastic yes. And so if you are in an interaction with someone that's, of a sexual nature or otherwise, and we see these types of responses, that means it's time to stop. And I think so often that's the problem when we're talking about sexual harassment, is that the harasser is just ignoring or failing to acknowledge nonverbal cues like this. And that is what's dehumanizing about that interaction. It's also important to be a positive and a proactive bystander. And it's been so meaningful to me when I've been reading about all these cases in the media of survivors of harassment and violence coming forward to talk about it. And it's coming out that there were all these people who knew, for example, that Harvey Weinstein was doing these things. They knew it or they saw it and they did nothing. And this is so often the case with sexual harassment and violence. And so it's really important for us to step up and be positive bystanders. Victims often respond passively to harassment, either ignoring the behavior or of just avoiding that person or downplaying the behavior. You might even talk to someone who you witnessed experiencing harassment and say, like, are you okay? I saw this happening. It's not uncommon for them to downplay and be like, oh, no, it's nothing, it's fine. And that goes back to not wanting to cause drama, not wanting to put their job at risk, or maybe not wanting to put someone else's job at risk. Victims want the behavior to end. They're often just fearful. And so it really becomes, I think, I would just encourage us to consider that it's our responsibility as a culture, as bystanders, as coworkers, friends, and family, to create safe spaces that have zero tolerance for sexual harassment and violence. And we can do that by stepping up and sometimes just saying things like, leave them alone. That's not funny. That's offensive. That's inappropriate. Stop it. That's harassment. So that we can work together to create culture change within our agencies. There are also ways to prevent sexual harassment at an organizational level, and we'll talk about each one of these briefly, but they could be a presentation unto themselves. So that includes organizational policies, in-person training, and then also changing the organizational culture. So I'm going to briefly talk about some key components of organizational policies that address sexual harassment. And again, for those of you who have this kind of influence or power within your agencies, I hope that you'll strongly consider some of these aspects. So an organizational anti-sexual harassment policy should apply to individuals at all levels of the organization, from leadership on out. There should be clear descriptions and examples of sexual harassment. So I gave many of those already in this presentation, and we in our department, at the Sexual Violence Response Department, also have some examples typed up if that's something you're interested in looking at to incorporate into a policy. It's important for your staff and employees to know exactly what constitutes sexual harassment, because again, many of us are socialized, quite frankly, to be perpetrators and to feel entitled to sex. And so some people may not even realize what sexual harassment is. A clear description of the complaint process so that there's no confusion about who that person should talk to and what the whole process is going to look like, so they're prepared and equipped for what they're getting themselves into, essentially. Measures to ensure that there's no perceived or actual bias in an investigation. There should be a reasonably prompt time frame for investigations, and that should be detailed in the policy. The policy should be completely transparent so that if someone wants to come forward and report, they know that they're going to be protected by their organization, that they aren't going to be discriminated against, or that they won't experience bias based on their identity or sexual orientation, that the investigation is going to happen in a timely manner, that there's interim measures in place to ensure their safety and well-being. And so Ginger talked about how some employers might have things like this in place. So it's going to be up to the organization to decide, do you want to have some kind of like temporary, measures in place to keep an alleged harasser away from the person that's complaining, for example. There should be measures around confidentiality in place. So if someone comes forward to report, their identity should be kept confidential as much as possible. A clear statement that any kind of retaliation against the complainant is prohibited and will be punished. And that second component of it is really key, because that shows any potential perpetrators and it may not just be the perpetrator, right? If the perpetrator or the person who's being accused has friends, or allies at the organization, those people might retaliate. And so it's important that they know up front, if you do this, this is exactly how we are going to respond to that type of behavior. And an assurance that an organization, if the claims are substantiated, is going to take immediate corrective action, and that details what that action is going to be. I pulled a lot of this information from this white paper from the Texas Sexual Assault Coalition. So thanks to our sister coalition. This is a great white paper that is available online if you just Google it, or if you don't want to go that route, you can always contact me or Ginger, anyone here at the coalition. We'd be happy to send that to you. But this paper details all of the things that should be included in an organizational policy in detail, and a lot of good information about training as well. So I highly recommend checking it out. Policy is not going to be enough. as we know, a lot of people either skim their HR manual or, sign it without reading the policies at all. And so it's really important to back up that policy with in-person training. Just best practice is to bring someone in to do the training as opposed to some kind of webinar or online modality. Training ensures that everyone is going to get the basic information about sexual harassment. When you do it in person, it provides a venue for people to ask questions because, again, we talked about this, it's a really nuanced issue and can be complex. And so sometimes people just genuinely want clarification as to what's the difference between flirting and harassment, what constitutes harassment. And in-person training, as I mentioned, has been shown to be effective in educating people on these topics. Again, it's really important that senior leadership doesn't think that they are somehow exempt from this type of behavior and shouldn't have to, participate in training. Everyone should attend training at all levels of the organization. It needs to be tailored to the setting with specific examples for that organization. So if someone's working in a bar, you have to make it real for them and meet them where they're at, and incorporate examples as they may happen in an alcohol serving establishment, for example. If you're bringing someone in to do a training, then it's important, if that organization has a policy in place, to share that policy so that the trainer can tailor the training to that organization's policies. As I mentioned, all of us are going to have different, levels of stringency in our policies, and so you just want the training to be aligned with that. Conducted in person with interactive trainers. It needs to be repeated and reinforced regularly as well. And it needs to be a safe space for people to ask questions. When you're doing trainings where you do bring in people at all levels of the organization, inherently that's just a part of our culture in America. There are those power differentials, and sometimes people with leaderships in the room, they're just not going to feel that it's safe to say everything that they're thinking or to ask all the questions that they have. And so measures need to be put into place to ensure that that safe space is provided, because we want to prevent these types of behaviors before they even happen. And keeping in mind that, as I've mentioned, I think many times now, some people, yes, they are predators, right? There are folks that they're predators, they're going to engage in sexually predatory behavior, and they're really dismissive of others as humans. Some harassers, I would say most harassers, are actually not predators, right? It's people who have been socialized to engage in this type of behavior, who feel entitled to engage in this type of behavior, or who really just don't realize that they're causing harm. And so for some people, all it's going to take is one training for them to start being more conscious about the way that they're interacting with other people. Or it might just take one person saying to them, that's harassment, that's offensive, that's not funny, and it's going to get them to start being more critical and conscious of their behavior. And so that's why it's really important that this is clear and easy to understand, it's a safe space, and it's reinforced multiple times. At the end of the day, the effectiveness of any policy or training is going to be entirely contingent upon that organization's culture. I mentioned our friend Bill earlier, who was working at a place that was all men, predominantly heterosexual white men, and a very patriarchal culture where they felt like it was okay to be discriminatory and make prejudiced and bigoted comments about, people who identify as LGBTQ. And it was not a safe space for Bill to speak up and out against those types of statements, because he knew that he would be fired, even if it wasn't, and knowing that that employer they weren't going to say, well, you're fired because you didn't laugh at us making their comment. They'd find another reason to fire him, but he knows that that's the reality. So if in an environment like that, there's going to be a lot of culture change that needs to happen before a policy or training is going to make an impact. But this is true for every place. Culture change needs to happen where everyone, including and especially actually senior leadership, are champions of equity and respect for everyone, regardless of their gender identity or their sexual orientation, and where sexual harassment and violence and sexism is just absolutely not tolerated by anyone. Where victim blaming doesn't happen, where rape myths aren't endorsed, and where people are really treating each other as I mentioned, with that dignity and respect. And it's that needs to happen in order for these policies and trainings to really be effective. And that's what needs to happen if we really want to make efforts towards ending sexual harassment and violence. So we provided some resources for you all here. Our helpline at the coalition is up there. You can always call us if you have needs around, if you have technical assistance questions, if you have needs around finding support and resources throughout the state. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's up there, and then the National Sexual Violence Resource Center and Workplaces Respond have some good materials around workplace sexual harassment as well. And then finally, my contact information is up there at the top, but you may or may not know we have a really great sexual violence response team here at the coalition. We've grown a lot in the last couple of years, and so you could feel free to contact me if you guys have any questions, but I might refer you out to some other members of our team who are all doing great work. So Lindsay is our sexual violence response manager. Victoria is our new sexual violence response coordinator. Both of them, as well as myself, do a lot of training and technical assistance for sexual assault service providers and responders, and we can help you in the development of organizational policies. We can do trainings around sexual harassment. Jason is our sexual violence policy coordinator. He is our registered lobbyist that's focusing on sexual violence issues at the Capitol, but he also does a lot of systems advocacy and can help with the development of sexual harassment policies. And then finally, Jamal is our new sexual violence prevention coordinator, and he is doing a lot of work with bystander intervention training and is a really good resource for that as well. So please feel free to reach out to any of us with any kinds of questions or technical assistance. We really love it. It's our job, so don't ever hesitate. And that's all I have, but I did see we had some questions in the Q&A, and so we're going to look at those. So one of the questions asked is, what if you provide housing and the client is physically a man but identifies as a woman and our facility is for women only? Do we legally have to house them? So the answer to that is, so first I want to say, if someone is identifying as a woman, then they are a woman. We need to respect the gender identity that people provide. And by federal law, yes, you cannot discriminate against someone based on their gender identity or sexual orientation. So you would need to house someone in this situation. Does anyone have any additional questions? You can either use the Q&A, which allows you to be anonymous or confidential, or you can use the chat. And we'll just give you a couple minutes to think about it and let us know. All right, well, thank you all so much for attending this. As we mentioned, this is recorded. Oh, is there a question? Oh, another question popped up. One moment. Okay, so a follow-up question, do we house them with the other women in the same bedroom and bathroom? So Sarah, these are really good questions, and we're actually going to be doing a webinar on housing, on shelter with people who identify as transgender, and we have a lot of really great resources about this. So what I would say is actually, if you want to follow up with us, you can email me and we can talk offline about some of this. And also to keep an eye out, because we will have a webinar coming up about it. And in the meantime, if you'd like to learn more, there's a really great website. Maybe I can put that in the chat. Let me see. So it's called forgeforward.org. Is a really great website to check out. They have amazing tools for people who are working with transgender survivors of sexual violence. And they have a lot of tips on how you can make your shelter gender inclusive, and also how you can be sure that you're affirming and inclusive in the advocacy you provide, as well as support groups and crisis intervention and other things like that. So I'd recommend checking that out. And then Sarah, if you want to follow up with me offline, and then for all of you, please, keep an eye out for our upcoming webinar. But thank you for those, are really good questions. All right, well, thank you all so much. Again, this webinar is recorded, and I really appreciate all of your time and your participation. And as I said before, if you have any additional questions or have any requests for training or technical assistance around this issue, please don't hesitate to reach out to our department or to go ahead and call our Sexual and Domestic Violence Helpline.
All right, we would like to thank everyone for participating today. And if you would like a certificate of attendance, I would ask that you would please email me directly at renee@acesdv.org. Thank you for attending and have a great day and enjoy the rest of your weekend.